Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, Val and the hounds claimed the Brinnsboar's cave as their own, but there's still work to be done before the Iron Wolf can begin his next move against the Machine King. The Iron Wolf prepares for war, next on the Seventh Valkyrie. Chapter 4. Sharpened and Honed. Val. The 5th day of winter, at dawn. When I woke up, the fire in the Brinnsboar's cave had mostly burned itself out, and I made my way in to check the dried and smoked meats laid across the rib cage. They were still glistening, but they had hardened and mostly caramelized, which would slow their spoiling. Slicing off a chunk, I bit in, chewing through the fiercely smelling meat into the center. Brinnsboar meat was far too gamey and strong-tasting to make much of an impact on any chef's table in any region, but it was absolutely packed full of nutrients. An old friend during the war claimed he could make you love Brinnsboar with a 4-week aging process and a slow roast with his home blend of herbs. But we had never had time for that on the warpath, so we'd settled for dried and smoked or freshly roasted. Everyone suffered and choked it down. I cleared out the ashes of the fire and left the meat where it was for now, tossing a chunk each to Edda and Rowan. They were stretching off their naps and questing around the cave mouth with renewed vigor after a full night's rest. Seeing them back to full energy lifted my spirits, and as I chewed down a second piece of Brinnsboar, I sat, thinking. I had no gear, no armor, none of my tools. But few weapons I did have I'd stolen from Rat and his men, which included the decent knife and one of the crossbows with the iridescent blue bolts, now drying. Even in the light of day, I didn't recognize the poison on it. The concept of a poison bolt was nothing new. They were used frequently by rebels and freelanders who weren't X's, but I'd never seen them designed to sedate, only to kill. I carefully stored them in a cave in a hollow between rocks, hoping to keep the bolts damp. You never know when they might be useful. Food I had handled with the Brinnsboar, and the land around here was still ripe with fruits and edible plants that I recognized. The cave would do for the worst of the weather, and the cold if need be. Otherwise, the Brinnsboar wouldn't have chosen it for the coming winter, but there was still a lot to figure out. I set off into the woods, with 3 very specific items in mind: moss-cap mushrooms, 4-charred sap, and trestle. They weren't exactly rare if you knew where to look, but it had been a long time since I'd foraged them. Fortunately, thanks to Edda and Rowan, finding one of each made it trivial to find more. Using Rat's knife, I collected the green-topped fungi, rich golden sap, and black-tipped herbs until I'd filled up the body of the second lantern, which I'd emptied and rinsed on the way over. When the whole lantern was full, I began to steadily crush the mixture into a black, green, and orange paste, then filled the remainder with water as we passed back over the creek. As I set the mixture up over some fat-soaked logs to heat up, my mind drifted to Nora, the missing member of our family. She would honestly be fine. There was always a use for horses in Edera, and she was calm, well-trained, dutiful, and well-behaved, which was good. My horse from the war, Northwind, would have kicked any stable boy half to death who tried to wrangle him, or saddle him up, or treat him as a pack horse, or attach him to a wagon. That was a true war beast, and he acted as such. Nora? She could handle a few days or even weeks of work. Leaving the mixture I'd concocted to boil, I checked over the hounds, giving each of them a full physical. Rowan had lost a few teeth during the fighting in Minns, but they were already growing back, and apart from a few ragged patches of fur, the little girl's power had healed him to a picture of health. His claws were honed, a habit wolfhounds kept on their own. His eyes were clear and responsive. His paws had recovered from the brush burn of sliding down through the new city, and all of his reflexes were up to full standard. He was explosive on the call, retained his vertical leap and agility, had peak pull and tear strength, and still had enough power in his jaws to snap a thick branch. Edda showed a few more signs of wear and tear from the day before. 3 of her claws had been broken off on her left front paw, but like the 2 teeth she was missing, those would grow back. Where the ring-mouthed snapper had gotten at her, 2 smooth, shallow circular pits covered in smooth skin dotted her back. But that young ex-girl's abilities had fixed those too. It would just be a matter of time and some rest before she was back to full strength. Still, it was noticeable that she wasn't at full strength. She was a little sluggish off the block, a little weak on her jumps to my shoulder, requiring extra step up, but her bite was still just as savage as it had been, maybe fueled by a little frustration at her weakness. I patted her on the back and rewarded the 2 of them as we finished the physicals. From our intelligence reports during the war, we'd learned that X-healing took just as much out of the one being healed as it did the healer. Less than 24 hours gone from that kind of experience, I wasn't surprised to see Edda still at a bit less than full strength, especially considering how bad she'd gotten hit by those snappers. Straight from the physical, and stopping only to stoke my fire again, I took them into a tracking exercise, partially because I needed to, and partially to lift Edda's spirits after watching Rowan excel with the physical portion. Rowan could be a bit of a prick to his sister, especially when they competed, and I needed to remind Edda where her truly astounding talents laid. I would start by giving both of them a sniff of a scent item. In this case, it was a specific chunk of the hours-old organ meat from the Brinnsboar. And then I would wander into the forest. It was a walk that reminded me of home. No sounds but the gentle call of a huna and the breeze in the forest. The Mandarian's coursing waters rushed just on the edge of sight through the forest. And it was beautiful. But I set my shoulders. I was not here to explore a new land. I wasn't here to relish time in the woods with my dogs. I was here in Reen, in the new and the old city, in the woods, hiding in a cave because I had to, and there was work to be done. Picking a random spot, I buried the meat a foot deep in a bush, then wandered even further to confuse them so they couldn't just track my scent, and finally returned all the way up the hills to where I'd started, and whistled out for them to begin the search. Each round, without fail, Edda tracked the meat down, loping out of the trees towards me with it held proudly in her jaws. Under trees, in the branches, even underground, she found it every time, until the last round where Rowan waited at the tree line, blindsided her at the last moment, and picked it up, running towards me like I hadn't seen the whole thing. Edda had always been able to run like a fired arrow, and while her brother was a touch faster over a short run, and she in the long distance, she blindsided him just as he came to drop the meat chunk at my feet. They fought, tumbling on the ground, snarling and yipping, barking, Edda bleeding from a scratch on her shoulders, Rowan from a few pinpoints where Edda had nipped him, and that was when I silenced them with a shout. They stopped, looking embarrassed, but I tossed them both a chunk of meat and brought them in together, a hand on each of their backs. Wolfhounds fought, that was just a part of their life. They hunted and competed and made each other better, but when it was time for them to stop, I always made sure that they stopped. Trooping back through the forest, I carved branches and sticks from the trees, whittling them down to a wide variety of wooden practice weapons. Then, after once again stoking my fires, I began the long practice of sparring with Edda and Rowan. I started with long pole lances, then moved on down to quarterstaffs, mauls, spears, great swords, long swords, short swords, shield and half-hander, dual blade, bare hand. Each time I laid out potential armor and variations in a constantly changing set of different drills. 1-on-1, 2-versus-1, each time challenging them to get a simulated kill or cripple with grip around the necks, legs, ankle tendons, belly, or eyes. I went at 30%, 50%, 70, 90, 100, challenging them, pushing them each time until their tongues were lolling and they had gotten sloppy. That was when I called them off and went through my own combination of strength, coordination, and skill drills. With a few rocks strapped to my back, I went through the complex set of exercises, all the while calling out various commands to Edda and Rowan to keep their vocabulary sharp and their reflexes and communication at top tier even when they were tired. Each command had a response needed from them, and it made it such that the words that they heard were intrinsic. In battle, you couldn't risk a second guess. I trained with the mentality that if you could operate at full skill, efficiency, and coordination when tired, then you were not at a disadvantage. So we would train tired, and each day we would push that weakening exhaustion another step further away, so that no matter how tired we became, we would be ready to fight, ready to hunt, and ready to kill. The sun had risen to mid-afternoon in the sky by the time we stopped. And then I began a long routine of recovery exercises by the shore of that snow-fed creek. This was a chance for them to relax their muscles and get a jump start on the next day. They'd need to get used to a much higher level of fitness and combat readiness before I would truly feel comfortable entering another battle with them. In Min's, it had been about survival. And while Edda and Rowan eventually snuggled up and dozed, the morning's competitions left behind as they nestled together, I didn't have the luxury of resting. With muscles aching, I returned to the boiling mixture I'd left smoking in a lantern at the front of the cave. Taking it off of the flame, I returned to the creek, splashing water on the lantern periodically and then finally dunking the body of it in the water to cool. The glass hissed at the sudden change of temperature, even after a few splashes of water, but it held and didn't shatter. At least one flash of good fortune. Once again, I stripped down, and then before I lost my nerve, I threw back 2 mouthfuls of the still bubbling black and orange sludge. The mixture slid down my throat like magma, then hit my stomach and began to churn, heating my gut, then my chest, and spreading out to every extremity and appendage of my body. I'd forgotten how quickly it worked, and by the time I stumbled into the cold water, my entire sense of being felt alight. Even the waves of sweat gushing through my pores failed to offer more than a clammy coating of warm liquid, as the mixture continued to burn inside me. With gritted teeth, I submerged in the river, bubbling heat inside me and shivering cold outside, all making me wonder why I hadn't burst into steam yet. I broke the surface with a gasping breath. The heat wasn't dying off. It was growing stronger and stronger until every nerve in my body was activated, screaming for release. I wanted to shout, but this was nothing. It had to be nothing. Because if I would let a simple recovery elixir stop me, there was no chance I would be able to face the war that was to come. I would do this 100 times if I had to, 1,000,000 times, every morning and every night if that's what it took to kill the Machine King. Their powers could make the X's stronger than us. Their powers could make them faster. They had abilities that I would never had, but I would not die because any fucking X was willing to go through more, sacrifice more, put their everything on the line more than I was. I submerged in the water again, flexing every muscle in my body and releasing, flexing and relaxing, and feeling as the heat grew, then peaked, then started to subside. As it faded, it dragged with it the feelings of tiredness, burned away from the muscles and sweated out, washed away. When the treatment was finally done, I packed up the remainder of the Firebelly freshener. I partially hated the name Night Spirit had given that recovery drink, but it had stuck in my head. Then I dragged the hounds into the cold water of the mountain stream, washing them off despite their squeaks of protest and those sad looks all dogs gave every single time they were washed. Even I couldn't have trained that out of them. When the dogs were clean, finally, I prepared a stew of organ meats and dried jerky in the boar's stomach, all slow-cooked and hung over a small fire. Then, with the hounds happily tired and now warmed up, I brushed them down using the girl's brush, and took another long arc around the cave with boar fat. I still had to build an axe, find some logs closer to the water, and spend the remaining daylight hours crafting a pirogue and oars functional enough to cross the river, but rough enough to avoid drawing suspicion. Then, it would be time for the night's work to begin. Want to know what happens next? Join us on Patreon to become a hero of Edera and get early access to episodes along with bonus features, director's commentary, and the full Tab to archive. You can also find other ways to support us at the links in the description, and we will see you next week.